One of the things the state's going to ask you about is what's been your historical payroll growth, particularly over the last 3 years. The more that you guys can have them coming in with, the faster we can turn things around in the end.
That's a very good point. So, although we're still very interested in what, traditionally a project would come into us and say, hey, we're going to create, 50 jobs or 100 jobs over 3 years. We're still very interested in those numbers, but in order to make an accurate determination of what the PIP will be and to compute this accordingly, we'll be very interested to know the payroll growth over the past 3 years and also the projected payroll growth. What would the increase in payroll be going forward? With that, the next payroll is pretty much self-explanatory, and CPI is what we're going to be using to compute the PIP. Who qualifies? This is a very important slide as we take a look at what the program was before and what we've changed it into. Now we're looking at what are the basic minimums of someone who qualified. Although we were looking at full-time equivalents, we've still stated that, or we've made the determination that we need to see at least 10 new jobs at the project site, generating the employees at 175% of the federal minimum wage, which computes to about $660,000 in new payroll. The reasons for the 10 new full-time jobs is we wanted to avoid the situation where some company may be hiring one CEO and paying $800,000 and wanting to get tax credits on that one person. So that's why we felt the need to make that determination to have at least 10 jobs.
Chad did give me the option when we discussed this, say that they could hire a new CEO and 9 yes men or women to go along with them, and that would still qualify.
Yeah, that's a good point. We want to at least see the 10 full-time jobs. And the $660,000 is the payroll of it's roughly 25 full-time equivalents making 175% of the minimum wage, which is about $12.60 an hour. Compute that out, gets $660,000 in annual or in new payroll. And this takes the place of what traditionally we've always looked at, and I think everyone is pretty much familiar with the 25-job magic number at $10.88 an hour, or the 10 jobs at 400% of the minimum wage, which is about $28 to $29 an hour. This, I think, is one of the most business-friendly aspects of the change because, as before we looked at, we may have seen, some companies, the criteria was 25 jobs at $10.88 an hour. The company may have come in and said, hey, we want to create 22 jobs at $21 an hour. And although we'd love to have those 21 jobs and the wages were good, it didn't meet that magic criteria of 25 jobs. So with this, as long as you're creating 10 new jobs and generating $660,000 in annual payroll, whatever the mix-up or the combinations is fine with us. Now we look at maybe 18 jobs coming in at $24, $25 an hour. That would qualify if it meets that $660,000 criteria. 11 jobs at $40 an hour, that would qualify, something like that. So I think that's much more business-friendly. And going forward, we will get away from the situation where in the past we may have seen companies who would drop below 25 jobs with their existing tax credits, which under the old program would render them ineligible to remain in the program. Now, as long as they maintain that X plus 660, whatever that original baseline payroll was, plus the 660 in new payroll, will be able to remain in the program. Which I think, as we look to companies that transition into lean manufacturing, may reduce some of the workforce, but pay the existing workers more, as long as they still meet that criteria, they would then still qualify. Here's our first scenario in the computation of the tax credit. We look at a 3-year company that you can see the payroll the income tax revenue at the site generate over time. It comes in $23,000. We're looking at the past trends, $48,000, $66,000 is when they would come in. We take the income tax revenue and we compute the baseline income tax revenue by taking it in and doing the math with the PIP, and then it transitions into $68,861, and you can see that grow over time. So this is a company, as we look at the assumptions, they came to us and they had 90 full-time equivalents at the project site at the time of approval, and an annual payroll of $2.8 million. They're proposing to create 60 new full-time equivalents at roughly $15 an hour. And the company's experienced large ramp-up growth over the previous 3 years, approximately 38%, and to compute the BITR, we're using the 2 times the CPI, which is 1.4 plus 1 is the PIP of 1.028, and I apologize, that should be a decimal. It should not be 1.028%. It should be 1.028. So if you multiply the income tax revenue times that number, you get the initial baseline income tax revenue. And then the company has met their commitments by year 3, and they've gone forward to exceed their commitments after that. And you can see by the graphical representation that they still receive credit for that.
Let me point out a couple things on this. Number one, the payroll increase factor. It's a little thing, but we're going to spend a little bit of time on it. It's slightly confusing. We looked at it 2 ways. You see here that we've got it capped at 2 times the consumer price index. What we didn't want to do is find ourselves in a situation where you have a company like this that's had significant growth over the past few years, and they're coming in and they're saying, okay, we're ready to take our company to the next level. And because they have had this significant growth over the past few years, we can't incentivize them because we've got this calculation on a payroll increase factor. So what we did is we tried to find a well-understood inflation factor and set what is normally a fairly high bar and say 2 times the increase in consumer prices. Look, if a company's growing at more than double, their wages and their income tax withholdings are growing at more than double the consumer price index, I think that's okay, and I think we want to incentivize them, and if they get a little extra benefit out of that than what one might want in theory, I think that's okay. Number one. Number two, again, a couple of things. You'll see this ends up, once you get through setting what that baseline payroll is, everything in here is stuff that is universally understood. We really try to focus this program, as you're talking to companies, in terms of the data that they need to provide us, is stuff they're pulling off the W-2s. They're pulling their payroll, and they're pulling the withholdings. And they're keeping their number of FTEs for internal purposes, or for reporting to BWC, or for wherever. Keep it to universally understood things, but really focus primarily on data that they're pulling off of the W-2s. So once we are able to explain how the calculation works, helping a company understand what the data is really going to give them is fairly easy, and how they're going to report it is fairly easy.
That's a really good point. And as I mentioned earlier, what we're asking companies to report on their annual reports going forward is no different from what they've reported in the past. They now, when a company reports to us, they're required to report annual payroll. They're required to report income tax revenue. So that hasn't changed. We're not asking a company to do anything that they didn't do before, or come up with some crazy computation that would be burdensome for them. In fact, it just simplifies it. And in the past, they would always have to include a spreadsheet with all the employees and all this data. That can be very cumbersome. We're not going to require that with the annual reports anymore. However, the company is still required to have that on site in the case of an audit, to produce that to us. But we want to get away, we want to simplify things. So the whole reporting process for a company, and although the first time you read this, it seems a little bit confusing, and you're thinking PIP and all these percentages, and isn't it just easier to go on jobs? But going forward, as a company looks at what truly grows a company and benefits the community, it's a growth of payroll, and that's really what we want to focus on. So in the end, I think it'll make it much easier for companies to report to us, and much easier for us to administer the program. Here's that same scenario again, once you've understood the nature of the 90 full-time equivalents, and then the 60 that they wanted to hire, what it looks like. And you can see by year 3, that's when they would have met their commitments, and then they exceed their commitments, and they go up by year 5 as their high point, and then say at year 6, they dip back down below, but they're still above their original commitment, and they still continue to retain and earn the credit. And say, for example, if this was a 50% at 6-year tax credit or something, whatever the difference is between those numbers, it would just be 50% of that over the term of the credit. So that's scenario 1, a 3-year company. Scenario 2 is a bit different. We put this in here just to understand, due to the nature of the economy and things that are going on, this was what we would refer to as a single contract dependent company. Say this may be an automotive supplier with one supplying a part to maybe one of the large automotive companies, and they have one single customer. So in effect, if they were to lose that contract, it would really hinder their business until they would be able to pick up additional business. So if you look, you can see they have pretty much a retained, or the payroll doesn't fluctuate, the income tax revenue doesn't fluctuate much in the first few years, and then maybe they got this contract, or they retooled, and they're selling this product, and they go up real high, but then after year 2 they lose the contract.